You didn't walk away to punish them or teach them a lesson. You walked away because you finally understood the difference between loving someone and losing yourself in the process. That realization carries a quiet kind of strength. When you leave with peace instead of pleading, arguing, or constantly trying to prove your worth, you remove the comfort an avoidant often depends on, the belief that your love will always be available no matter how little they give in return. At first, they often feel relieved, not because you meant nothing to them, but because emotional closeness has always felt like pressure. Pressure to stay consistent, emotionally available, vulnerable, and imperfect. Once you stop reaching for them, that pressure seems to disappear. They convince themselves everything is fine and that the separation was the right decision for both of you. But relief built on escaping emotions never lasts. Eventually, the silence begins to change. While you spent the relationship living with uncertainty, wondering about delayed replies, emotional distance, and confusing mixed signals, they now experience a different kind of silence. It is the silence of consequences, the silence that comes from realizing the person who always stayed has finally stopped chasing. That is when unexpected memories begin rising to the surface. They remember your kindness, your patience, your laughter, and how hard you tried to make the relationship work. At first, those memories do not bring comfort. They bring discomfort because they challenge the story they have been telling themselves. Without drama or blame, you leave them with no villain to point toward. Your calmness quietly forces them to face themselves. Stay with me, because what happens next explains why your silence often becomes more powerful than anything you could have said. What unsettles them most is not simply that you left, it is that you stopped trying to convince them to choose you. Avoidant individuals often become accustomed to subtle emotional patterns. They expect that when they create distance, you will move closer. They expect you will accept small efforts as meaningful progress and continue carrying the emotional weight of the relationship. When that familiar pattern suddenly ends, their nervous system begins feeling unsettled. Instead of openly expressing their emotions, they may test the waters with something small, a story view, a random like, or a simple message saying, "Hey." If you do not respond right away, reality becomes much harder to ignore. They can no longer assume you are still waiting. That is when regret often begins. It does not always look like sadness. Sometimes it appears as frustration, defensiveness, or repeatedly replaying the relationship while focusing on your emotional reactions instead of their emotional absence. Yet deep down, many quietly understand the truth. You were never asking for perfection. You were asking for presence. You were not demanding endless reassurance. You wanted consistency. You simply wanted to feel loved without constantly questioning where you stood. The longer you remain peaceful, the more they are forced to face something they have avoided for years. Real intimacy requires letting go of control. It asks for honesty, accountability, and the willingness to stay instead of disappearing whenever vulnerability becomes uncomfortable. Don't miss this next insight because it reveals the emotional conflict many avoidant people struggle to admit, even to themselves. Inside them, desire and fear begin pulling in opposite directions. They may miss you deeply, but missing you feels vulnerable. Feeling vulnerable makes them withdraw once again, and withdrawing only makes the loss feel even greater. It becomes a painful cycle they usually hide behind work, distractions, humor, or pretending everything is completely normal. Your peaceful exit becomes powerful because you stopped sacrificing yourself for a relationship that demanded your silence. You stopped negotiating your value and allowed reality to speak louder than endless explanations ever could. Will they change? Maybe, maybe not. Some avoidant people genuinely feel the loss, yet still choose familiar patterns over personal growth because change feels frightening. Others regret everything, but simply lack the emotional tools needed to repair what they damaged. But regardless of what they decide, something far more important begins happening within you. You stop measuring love by how much pain you can tolerate. You stop believing suffering is proof of devotion. Instead, you begin treating yourself with the same patience, compassion, and understanding you spent giving to someone else. That is where real healing begins. It is the moment your self-worth no longer depends on whether another person finally recognizes your value. From that place, your peace becomes stronger than your fear, your boundaries become stronger than your loneliness, and your future is no longer controlled by someone else's emotional uncertainty. In the end, the greatest transformation is not whether they finally come back or realize what they lost. The greatest transformation is realizing you no longer need another person's approval to know your own worth. That quiet confidence changes every relationship you build from that moment forward because you are no longer searching for someone to complete you. You are choosing connections that honor the person you have already become. You eventually realize the person who needed convincing was never them. It was you. When you truly understand that, your silence is no longer the silence of waiting. It becomes the silence of choosing yourself. And that is the moment everything begins to change. Instead of chasing love that keeps running away, you finally start walking toward the kind of love that stays. Meanwhile, they often become restless. They stay busy, bury themselves in work, scroll endlessly, spend more time going out, or seek attention from other people, anything to drown out the silence. Silence invites reflection, and reflection leads to uncomfortable questions. Those questions eventually point toward responsibility, and responsibility is exactly what they have spent years avoiding. Your peaceful departure sends a message they cannot easily ignore. It quietly says, "I will no longer lose myself, just to keep a place in your life." It says, "I am finished proving my love by accepting confusion." It says, "Someone who truly wanted me would never make me feel as though my love was a burden." That becomes the mirror they cannot escape. It reflects not only what they lost, but also the patient, steady love they may never have fully appreciated while it was still in front of them. Stay with me because the next part reveals why many avoidant people reach out only after they begin facing that reality. This is often the point where they begin testing the connection. Vulnerability still feels risky, so they choose safer approaches: a casual text, a funny meme, a quick message asking, "How have you been?" Small gestures allow them to reconnect without exposing the deeper emotions they are still struggling to face. If you respond immediately, they regain the comfort of connection without ever having the difficult conversation that truly matters. If you do not respond, they may retreat behind the belief that distance was always unavoidable, but your peace has now become your boundary. For the first time, they experience what emotional distance actually costs. They begin realizing they can no longer pull you back with the smallest amount of effort. They slowly understand that your availability was never guaranteed. That realization can be painful. Gradually, they recognize that what they lost was never someone trying to control them. You were not asking for perfection or impossible expectations. You simply wanted honesty, consistency, and emotional presence. You wanted to build something safe together. Only then do they begin understanding the difference between freedom and emptiness. The freedom they protected so fiercely often begins feeling more like loneliness. Their routines continue. Life appears normal from the outside, yet something quietly feels missing. Very few avoidant people openly admit this. Instead of saying, "I'm afraid I lost you," they may say things like, "I've been thinking a lot lately," or "I miss our conversations." Direct emotional honesty still feels too exposing, but whether they admit it or not, your peaceful exit forces them to experience something they once escaped. Remember this, not because you should hope they suffer, but because you should never mistake your calm departure as proof that you never mattered. A peaceful goodbye leaves a lasting impression because it does not depend on drama. It quietly asks the other person to face themselves. Even so, your healing cannot depend on whether they awaken to what happened. Some people fully recognize what they lost and still choose familiar habits instead of personal growth. If your self-worth depends on whether they return as a different person, you remain trapped inside the same emotional cycle. Let your peace become your closure. The greatest victory is not that they finally understand your value. The greatest victory is that you finally stopped abandoning yourself just to earn their understanding. Deep down, you never wanted to win a battle. You simply wanted to feel emotionally safe. You wanted love that did not require constant guessing, endless overthinking, or waiting for the next emotional withdrawal. You tried to become their safe place. You were patient, understanding, and endlessly compassionate, hoping their emotional walls would eventually come down. Instead, those walls simply became harder to recognize. They hid behind being busy, needing space, avoiding difficult emotions, or telling you that you were overthinking everything. Because you loved them, you kept translating their distance into hope. You believed the caring version you occasionally saw was the real version waiting to emerge. Those brief moments of warmth kept your hope alive, and without realizing it, you stayed much longer than you should have. Your loyalty allowed the avoidant side of them to remain comfortable. They learned they could receive love without offering vulnerability, enjoy closeness without accountability, and rely on you to carry the emotional weight while they continued protecting themselves. Don't miss what comes next, because this is where everything quietly begins to shift. Then everything changed the moment you left peacefully. You did not create chaos. You did not seek revenge. You did not leave them with another argument they could dismiss or another emotional reaction they could blame. You simply walked away with quiet dignity. That calm removed every excuse. They could no longer point to your emotions or convince themselves you were the problem. All that remained was one undeniable truth: you were willing to love fully, while they kept hiding from it. Many people believe avoidant individuals do not feel deeply. The reality is often much more complicated. They usually feel deeply, but they bury those emotions because vulnerability has never felt safe. Once your presence disappears, there is nothing left to distract them from their own heart. At first, relief may return. The pressure of intimacy fades, and they convince themselves life is easier. But relief built on avoidance never lasts forever. Eventually, a different kind of silence arrives, the silence they never chose. Your name no longer appears on their phone. No one is patiently holding space for them anymore. That is when memories begin arriving without warning. They remember your kindness, your patience, the way you softened your own needs to protect theirs, and how often you chose understanding instead of conflict. They slowly begin realizing just how much of yourself you sacrificed to keep the relationship alive. Sometimes that realization becomes impossible to outrun. Over time, those memories begin changing. They stop feeling like reminders of someone who asked for too much and become evidence that they were deeply loved by someone who genuinely cared. They begin realizing they were given a kind of love they simply did not know how to receive. That is why a peaceful goodbye carries such lasting power. It does not force another person to change. It simply allows the truth to become impossible to ignore. And while they are left facing that truth, you continue moving towards something even more valuable, a life where your peace, your self-respect, and your happiness no longer depend on someone else's ability to love you the way you deserved from the very beginning. It creates a gap between the story they told themselves and the reality they can no longer ignore. If you had yelled, they could have blamed your anger. If you had begged, they could have called you desperate. If you had attacked them, they could have convinced themselves you were the problem, but you did not leave them with excuses. You left with dignity, calmness, and self-respect. That quiet exit becomes a mirror. Instead of defending themselves from your emotions, they are left facing the possibility that the relationship did not fall apart because you loved too much. It struggled because they kept avoiding emotional closeness. Slowly, feelings they spent pushing away begin rising to the surface. Guilt for taking your love for granted. Shame for creating so much distance, fear that they allowed someone truly special to walk away. Even if they cannot clearly identify those emotions, they often appear as restlessness, frustration, or a lingering feeling that something important is missing. Rather than expressing those feelings directly, many avoidant people quietly test the connection. They send a casual text, react to one of your stories, or ask a simple question like, "How have you been?" hoping to reconnect without addressing what really happened. Accountability feels much more frightening than small talk because admitting the truth means facing their own emotional patterns. If you do not immediately respond or treat those small gestures as a brand new beginning, something begins changing inside them. They realize your warmth is no longer guaranteed. They can no longer depend on your endless patience to erase the consequences of emotional distance. Stay with me, because what happens next explains why healthy boundaries often have a much deeper impact than endless explanations ever could. Without you carrying the relationship, they are left alone with themselves. Sometimes that leads to genuine growth. Sometimes it leads to denial. Sometimes they quickly search for another distraction. Not because you were easy to forget, but because remembering you forces them to face parts of themselves they have spent years avoiding. But your responsibility is never to wait for that outcome. Your responsibility is protecting your own heart. Walking away peacefully means you stop trying to rescue someone who refuses to face themselves. Instead, you begin giving yourself the consistency, care, and emotional safety you were searching for all along. Your calm was never surrender. It was never pretending you did not care. It was the moment you decided to stop negotiating with someone who only offered love when it felt comfortable for them. Chasing rarely creates the change we hope for. To an avoidant, constant pursuit often becomes reassurance that they can continue repeating the same emotional pattern without losing you. You reach out, they pull away, you explain your feelings, they become even quieter. You become more patient and they grow more distant. Eventually you begin believing that if you simply loved harder, communicated better, or became even more understanding, they would finally feel safe enough to stay. But all that truly does is remove the natural consequences of their inconsistency. One person cannot carry an entire relationship alone. The moment you step away with peace instead of desperation, everything quietly begins shifting. Not because you are playing games or trying to appear mysterious, but because you stop participating in a relationship where your love is constantly exchanged for occasional attention. Do not miss this next insight because it explains why your silence often says more than your words ever could. You stop bargaining for closeness. You stop proving your worth through endless patience. You quietly show that your value is not something another person gets to decide. When you were chasing them, they could focus on your reactions instead of their own behavior. Your tears became the problem instead of their emotional absence. Your questions became signs of neediness instead of reasonable requests for connection. But calmness removes that distraction. At first, they may feel relieved because the pressure of intimacy seems to disappear. Yet relief created by avoidance eventually turns into emptiness. Real peace comes from facing reality. Emptiness comes from escaping it. When you leave, you also leave behind the role you carried for so long. You stop being the emotional translator, the peacemaker, and the person who always forgives first. The relationship no longer survives on your effort alone. That is when they begin realizing your love was never something they were automatically entitled to. It was a gift they quietly assumed would always be there. They notice it in unexpected moments, when they instinctively reach for their phone, when life becomes stressful and your calming presence is gone, or when they remember how often you brought warmth into places where they offered distance. Your calm creates a powerful contrast. It quietly reminds them that you never demanded perfection. You simply asked for honesty, consistency, and emotional presence. Some avoidant people may test the waters again through casual messages or small gestures. Often, those actions come from fear rather than confidence. They want connection without exposing their heart. But your calm teaches something important. Access to you is no longer automatic. It is earned through consistency, honesty, and genuine effort. By keeping your boundaries without anger, bitterness, or revenge, you show both them and yourself that real love can never be built on one person carrying all the emotional weight. Healthy love grows when two people willingly choose each other, take responsibility for their actions, and create emotional safety together. That is the kind of relationship your peace is leading you toward. And once you truly understand that, you stop chasing what repeatedly hurts you and begin choosing what genuinely helps you heal. Your peace is no longer something another person can borrow whenever they feel lonely. Your love is not an endless resource for someone who refuses to grow. Your heart is no longer a place where people can disappear, return, and expect everything to remain exactly the same. That is where your value becomes impossible to ignore, not because you keep proving it, but because you stop defending it. You stop explaining why you deserve respect. You stop teaching someone how to love you. You stop turning every disagreement into another opportunity to convince them to care. Instead, you begin living by one simple truth. If love has to be begged for, it is not the kind of love you are meant to keep. Real strength is not simply saying you have standards. Real strength is living by them every single day. You realize you can miss someone without returning to a relationship that constantly left you confused. You can still care deeply about them while loving yourself enough to walk away. You can remain kind without abandoning your own needs. While so much attention is placed on what happens inside the avoidant, something far more important begins happening inside you. Your body slowly starts relaxing. Your mind stops replaying every conversation, searching for the perfect words that might have changed the outcome. Day by day, your heart begins finding its way back home. You rediscover stability, not the kind that depends on whether someone replies to your message or suddenly becomes affectionate, but the kind that comes from knowing your peace no longer depends on another person's inconsistency. Stay with me because this next realization is often the moment true healing finally begins. The moment you stop chasing, you stop placing your self-worth in someone else's hands. Their emotional distance is no longer your responsibility to solve. Their mixed signals no longer control your entire day. Whether they ever apologize or not, your quiet departure teaches one lasting truth. You are not someone who should ever be loved halfway. Avoidant individuals often appear emotionally strong because they seem calm, independent, and untouched by what happens around them. At first, that emotional distance can easily look like confidence. It may seem as though they never need reassurance, closeness, or deep emotional connection. But emotional distance is not always strength. Often it is control. It is staying close enough to receive love while remaining far enough away to avoid accountability. It is protecting yourself from vulnerability by always keeping one foot outside the relationship. When you love someone like that, you slowly begin filling every emotional gap they leave behind. You explain what they refuse to say. You give meaning to long periods of silence. Small moments of affection begin feeling like huge victories because you keep hoping they will finally lower their guard. Meanwhile, the pattern quietly repeats itself. They withdraw and you move closer. They become distant and you become even more understanding. They shut down emotionally and you carry even more of the emotional weight. Without realizing it, they slowly learn that creating distance costs them very little because you are always there to repair the connection. That is why emotional avoidance is often mistaken for confidence. Someone who hides their emotions may appear powerful from the outside, but real emotional strength is never about avoiding closeness. True security is staying present even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Do not miss this next insight because it explains why walking away peacefully creates a deeper impact than endlessly trying to be understood. Avoidance is a survival strategy, not emotional freedom. That strategy only works as long as someone else continues absorbing its emotional consequences. The moment you stop begging, everything begins changing. You do not threaten them. You do not send endless messages. You do not fight to be understood. You quietly accept reality and step away. Those kinds of consequences cannot be argued with. At first, they may convince themselves you will return the way you always have. They may believe you are simply upset, and that time will eventually reset everything. But sooner or later, the silence becomes impossible to ignore. Without your constant effort, there is nothing left to distract them from the truth.